My name's Natalie Pierce, and I've been working in compliance for over 8 years. Not the most glamorous field, I'll admit, but it's crucial work. Every regulation, every procedure, every tiny detail matters because one missed step can cost a company millions. That's something I learned early in my career, and it shaped how I approach every single review. I still remember my first week in compliance at my previous job. My mentor, an old-school compliance officer named George, pulled me aside and said something I'll never forget. Natalie, in this field, being fast doesn't make you good. Being thorough makes you good. The moment you start cutting corners is the moment you put everything at risk. He was right, and I've carried that philosophy with me ever since. I was working at Pinnacle Technologies, a mid-sized software company that specialized in financial applications. The company had about 350 employees spread across 3 floors of a sleek downtown office building. You'd think a company dealing with financial software would understand the importance of compliance, right? Well, you'd be surprised how many tech companies treat compliance like an afterthought, something to check off a list rather than a critical business function. Pinnacle had grown fast, maybe too fast. They'd started as a scrappy startup 5 years earlier and had exploded into this major player in the financial software space almost overnight. Their flagship product, Secure Finance Pro, was used by over 200 banks and credit unions across the country. But with that rapid growth came growing pains, and one of those pain points was a fundamental misunderstanding of what compliance work actually entailed. My direct supervisor was this guy named Robert Martinez. Rob, as he liked everyone to call him, was one of those managers who'd climbed the corporate ladder fast. He'd joined Pinnacle 2 years earlier as a project manager and had been promoted 3 times since then. He had that smooth-talking, results-oriented mentality that impressed the executives. You know the type, always talking about synergies and optimizing workflows and maximizing efficiency metrics. The problem? He didn't understand compliance work at all. To him, it was just paperwork that slowed things down. I'll never forget the first time he sat in on one of my quarterly compliance presentations to the executive team. Afterwards, he pulled me aside and said, "Next time, can you just give them the highlights? All those technical details make people's eyes glaze over." That was my first red flag about Rob. He didn't understand that those technical details were literally the difference between the company staying in business and facing massive regulatory fines. But I tried to work with him, thinking maybe I could help him understand the importance of what we did. Now, I want you to understand something about compliance reviews. They're not like other business tasks where you can just speed through and hope for the best. Every single line item needs verification. Every process needs documentation. Every regulation needs cross-referencing with current standards. It's meticulous work by design, because the consequences of missing something aren't just embarrassing, they can be catastrophic. Let me give you an example of what I mean. When reviewing data encryption standards, it's not enough to just check that encryption exists. You need to verify the encryption strength, confirm it meets current regulatory requirements, ensure key management protocols are properly implemented, validate that encrypted data can be properly decrypted when needed for audits, and document the entire process in a way that regulators can understand and verify. That single encryption check alone can take half a day of careful analysis. Multiply that by dozens of different compliance areas, and you start to understand why thorough reviews take time. But try explaining that to someone who thinks compliance is just about checking boxes. But Rob never got that. He'd constantly make comments about my work pace, rolling his eyes when I'd spend what he considered too long on reviews. He'd joke about my perfectionist tendencies in team meetings, making me feel like my thoroughness was somehow holding the department back. He loved using phrases like analysis paralysis and diminishing returns whenever I tried to explain why certain checks took time. I remember one particularly frustrating incident about 6 months before the big compliance review. I was working on a routine quarterly assessment, and I discovered what looked like a potential vulnerability in our user authentication system. It wasn't an immediate crisis, but it was something that needed attention before our next major review. I spent 3 days investigating, documenting the issue, and preparing recommendations for fixes. When I presented my findings to Rob, his first response wasn't "good catch" or "let's fix this." Instead, he said, "Natalie, you spent 3 days on something that might not even be a real problem. That's exactly the kind of inefficiency we need to eliminate." He wasn't wrong that it took 3 days. But he was completely wrong about the importance of finding potential issues before they became real problems. That's the thing about compliance work, you're always looking for problems that haven't happened yet, and that requires time and attention to detail. The breaking point came during our quarterly compliance review for our flagship product, Secure Finance Pro. This was a big deal. We were up for recertification with several regulatory bodies, and any violations could affect our ability to serve financial institutions. We're talking about certifications that took months to originally obtain and cost the company over $200,000 in consulting fees and system upgrades. The review covered everything from data encryption standards to user authentication protocols to audit trail requirements. There were literally 847 different compliance checkpoints across 12 regulatory frameworks. Each checkpoint required not just verification, but documentation that could withstand scrutiny from external auditors. I'd been preparing for this review for weeks. I'd created detailed checklists, gathered all the necessary documentation, and started preliminary assessments of each compliance area. I had color-coded spreadsheets tracking the status of each requirement, with notes about potential issues and areas that needed deeper investigation. This wasn't my first rodeo. I knew exactly how long thorough reviews took and what potential issues to look for. In my preliminary assessment, I'd already identified 17 areas that needed closer examination. Not violations necessarily, but areas where our documentation was incomplete or where regulatory standards had been updated since our last review. That's normal for a review of this scope, you always find things that need attention. But each of those 17 areas would require additional time to properly assess and document. That's when Rob called me into his office. "Natalie," he said with that condescending smile I'd grown to hate, "I'm making some changes to the compliance review structure." I felt my stomach drop. "What kind of changes?" "Well, I'm bringing in Jake Thompson to lead the review. You'll be supporting him, but he'll be the primary reviewer." Jake Thompson. A guy who'd been with the company for 6 months and had never done a compliance review in his life. He was smart, don't get me wrong, and he had an impressive resume from his previous job at a major consulting firm. But he had zero experience with regulatory requirements. His background was in general IT operations and system optimization, important skills, but completely different from compliance work. Jake was also Rob's kind of employee. He was fast, confident, and always ready with solutions. He had this can-do attitude that Rob loved, always volunteering for high-visibility projects and never pushing back on tight deadlines. From Rob's perspective, Jake represented everything he thought was missing from the compliance team: speed and efficiency. What Rob didn't understand, and what Jake was about to learn the hard way, was that confidence without expertise is dangerous in compliance work. The regulations we were dealing with weren't suggestions, they were legal requirements backed by federal oversight agencies. Getting them wrong didn't just mean a stern email from management, it meant potential fines, license revocations, and in extreme cases, criminal liability for company executives. "Rob, I don't understand. I've been handling these reviews for 3 years. I know every regulation inside and out." He leaned back in his chair, and here's where he said the words that still make my blood boil: "Look, Natalie, you're too detail-obsessed and very slow. Jake's got fresh eyes and can move things along faster. We need to streamline this process." Too detail-obsessed. In compliance. Let that sink in for a moment. I took a deep breath. Every part of me wanted to argue, to explain why those details mattered, to fight for my role. But I could see in his eyes that his mind was made up. So instead, I did something that probably surprised him. I stepped back quietly. "Okay," I said simply. "I'll brief Jake on what I prepared so far and support however you need me to." Rob looked almost disappointed that I didn't push back. Maybe he was expecting a fight that would justify his decision. But I'd learned something valuable in my years in corporate life: sometimes the best response is to let people make their own mistakes. Over the next few days, I watched Jake dive into the review with the confidence of someone who didn't know what they didn't know. He skimmed through documentation that should have been thoroughly analyzed. He checked boxes without understanding what they meant. He moved through sections at lightning speed, proud of his efficiency. I remember watching him review our data encryption protocols, something that should have taken at least 4 hours of careful analysis. Jake spent 20 minutes on it. 20 minutes to verify that we were properly encrypting sensitive financial data according to current federal standards. When I asked him about specific encryption key management procedures, he said, "It looks fine to me. The system says encryption is enabled, so we're good." That's when I knew we were in trouble. Encryption is enabled doesn't mean you're compliant. You need to verify the encryption strength, confirm proper key rotation, ensure adequate access controls, validate backup and recovery procedures for encrypted data, and document everything in a way that external auditors can verify. But Jake didn't know what he didn't know. I offered guidance when asked, but I didn't push. When Jake dismissed certain regulatory requirements as probably not applicable, I documented my concerns but didn't insist. When he overlooked critical audit trail requirements, I mentioned it once and then let it go. I created what I called my shadow documentation, detailed notes about every area where I believed Jake's assessment was insufficient, just in case we needed it later. Rob was thrilled with Jake's pace. "See," he told me smugly. "This is what efficiency looks like. Jake's going to finish this review in half the time it would have taken you." And he did finish faster. Much faster. Jake completed the entire compliance review in just 4 days, a process that typically took me 2 weeks of careful analysis. Rob praised his speed and efficiency in the department meeting, making pointed comments about new approaches and not getting bogged down in unnecessary details. I'll never forget that department meeting. Rob stood up in front of the whole team and said, "This is what I've been talking about. Jake here just completed a major compliance review in 4 days. 4 days? That's the kind of efficiency we need to bring to all our processes." Then he looked directly at me and added, "Maybe we've been overthinking these reviews all along." The room was uncomfortable silent. My colleagues knew how much work went into proper compliance reviews. They'd seen me working nights and weekends to meet deadlines while maintaining thorough documentation. But nobody wanted to contradict Rob in front of the whole team. Jake, to his credit, looked a little uncomfortable with the praise. After the meeting, he pulled me aside and asked, "Did I miss anything important? I feel like I might have rushed through some sections." I appreciated that he asked, but by then it was too late. The review was already submitted. The review was submitted to our regulatory partners, and we waited for their response. In the meantime, Rob was already talking about restructuring all our compliance processes around Jake's streamlined approach. He scheduled meetings with the executive team to discuss compliance process optimization and started drafting new procedures that would cut review times in half. I spent those waiting days in a strange state of anxiety. Part of me hoped Jake had somehow managed to catch everything important despite his rushed approach. But the professional part of me, the part that had been doing this work for 8 years, knew better. I kept thinking about all those areas in my shadow documentation where I'd noted potential issues that Jake had glossed over. The worst part was that I couldn't even enjoy the temporary reduction in my workload. Rob had reassigned me to routine monitoring tasks, basically data entry and report generation. After years of being the go-to person for complex compliance issues, I was suddenly doing work that could have been handled by an intern. It was demoralizing, and it made me question whether I was actually as good at my job as I'd thought. Then came Thursday morning, exactly 4 days after Jake submitted the review. I was at my desk, working on routine compliance monitoring tasks, when I heard running footsteps in the hallway. And I mean running, not fast walking, but actual running. In our corporate environment, people didn't run unless there was a real emergency. The office door burst open, and there was Rob, his face flushed red, eyes wide with panic. His usually perfect hair was disheveled, and he was clutching a folder of papers so tightly his knuckles were white. I'd never seen Rob look anything less than composed, so seeing him in this state immediately put everyone in the office on high alert. "Why didn't anyone catch this violation?" he shouted, waving papers in the air like he was trying to signal for help. The entire office went silent. Rob never shouted. He prided himself on being cool and collected. "What violation?" Jake asked, looking confused. Rob slammed the papers down on Jake's desk with such force that Jake's coffee mug jumped. "The regulatory board found a critical audit trail deficiency in Secure Finance Pro. They're threatening to revoke our certification unless we fix it immediately and explain how we missed it in our review." The blood drained from Jake's face. He picked up the papers with shaking hands and started reading through the regulatory board's findings. I could see him scanning the technical language, trying to understand what had gone wrong. My heart sank, but not with surprise. I knew exactly which violation they'd found because I'd flagged it in my preliminary notes, the ones Jake had dismissed as unnecessary detail. It was the updated audit trail requirements for high-value financial transactions that had gone into effect 6 weeks earlier. The regulations were complex and technical, requiring additional verification steps and enhanced documentation for any transaction over $50,000. This wasn't some obscure regulatory interpretation either. This was a clearly defined requirement that applied directly to our core product functionality. Secure Finance Pro processed thousands of transactions over $50,000 every day for our banking clients. Every single one of those transactions needed to meet the updated audit trail standards, and our current system didn't even come close. But I checked the audit trail requirements, Jake protested, frantically shuffling through his notes. You checked the basic requirements, Rob snapped. But you missed the updated standards that went into effect last month. The ones that require additional verification steps for financial transactions over $50,000. I watched this unfold with a mixture of vindication and genuine concern for the company. This wasn't just about being right, this was about a real problem that could seriously impact Pinnacle Technologies. Rob turned to me, his earlier smugness completely gone. Natalie, did you know about these updated standards? Here was my moment. I could have been petty. I could have reminded him about how he dismissed my detail obsession. Instead, I took the high road. Yes, I said quietly. I flagged them in my preliminary assessment notes. The updated audit trail requirements were published 6 weeks ago, and I'd been tracking them as part of my review preparation. The room was dead silent. You could literally hear the air conditioning humming. Why didn't you include them in the final review? Rob asked, his voice much quieter now. I mentioned them to Jake, but the decision was made that they weren't applicable to our current setup. I documented my concerns in the support files. Jake's face went pale. He started frantically searching through the documents I'd provided him. Rob closed his eyes and rubbed his temples. How long do we have to fix this? The regulatory board is giving us 2 weeks to implement the necessary changes and provide documentation that we're compliant. If we don't meet the deadline, they'll suspend our certification pending a full audit. The weight of that statement settled over the room. Losing certification would mean losing most of our financial industry clients. It could literally put the company out of business. What do we need to do? Rob asked, and for the first time since I'd known him, he sounded genuinely humble. I'd already been thinking about this since the moment he'd mentioned the violation. We need to implement additional verification steps for high-value transactions, update our documentation processes, and create audit trails that meet the new standards. It's going to require changes to both our software and our internal procedures. How long will that take? If we start today and work around the clock? We might be able to get it done in 10 days. But it's going to require coordination between development, operations, and compliance. And every single change needs to be thoroughly tested and documented. Rob looked at me with new eyes. Can you lead this effort? I could have said no. I could have reminded him that I was too detail-obsessed and very slow. Instead, I nodded. I'll need full authority to make necessary changes and access to whatever resources I require. Done. Whatever you need. What followed were the most intense 10 days of my career. I worked 18-hour days, coordinating with developers to implement the new audit trail requirements, working with the operations team to update procedures, and creating detailed documentation for every single change. The development work alone was staggering. We needed to modify core system functions that handled transaction processing, add new database fields for enhanced audit tracking, implement additional security measures for audit log protection, and create new reporting capabilities that could generate the detailed transaction histories regulators required. But here's the thing about being detail-obsessed: when you're used to thinking about every possible angle, you're prepared for crisis situations like this. I already had mental frameworks for how these systems should work. I'd been thinking about potential gaps and solutions long before they became urgent problems. While Jake and Rob were scrambling to understand what the violations even meant, I was already drafting implementation plans. I brought in Tim Walsh from our development team and Alicia Kumar from operations, and we essentially lived in the conference room for those 10 days. We had whiteboards covered with technical diagrams, project timelines, and regulatory requirement checklists. We ordered pizza for dinner 6 nights in a row and kept the coffee machine running around the clock. The toughest part wasn't the technical implementation, it was the documentation. Regulators don't just want to see that you've fixed problems, they want detailed explanations of how the problems occurred, what steps you've taken to fix them, and what procedures you've implemented to prevent similar issues in the future. Every change needed to be documented in excruciating detail, with test results and validation procedures clearly outlined. We made the deadline with 2 days to spare. The regulatory board reviewed our changes and not only accepted them but actually commended us for the thoroughness of our compliance framework. We not only kept our certification but actually received a letter of recognition for our proactive approach to regulatory compliance. That letter was something else. It specifically mentioned our comprehensive documentation procedures and detailed attention to regulatory requirements. The regulatory board noted that our response demonstrated exceptional understanding of compliance obligations and industry best practices. Reading that letter after everything we'd been through was incredibly validating. But more importantly, we'd saved the company. Losing that certification would have meant losing our biggest clients, the major banks and credit unions that made up 80% of our revenue. We're talking about contracts worth over $15 million annually. The company would have survived losing the certification, but it would have meant massive layoffs and a complete restructuring of our business model. The aftermath was interesting. Rob never again made jokes about my work pace or attention to detail. In fact, he started explicitly asking for my input on timeline estimates and process requirements. Jake, to his credit, asked if he could shadow me on the next compliance review to learn the proper approach. But the real change was in how the entire company viewed compliance work. The executive team, who'd heard about the near miss through the grapevine, suddenly understood that compliance wasn't just bureaucratic paperwork, it was essential business protection. Rob eventually pulled me aside for a private conversation. "Natalie, I owe you an apology. I didn't understand the complexity of what you do, and I made assumptions about efficiency that were completely wrong. I appreciated the apology, but more importantly, I'd learned something valuable about my own worth. Sometimes being thorough isn't a flaw, it's exactly what's needed. Sometimes being slow means being careful enough to catch problems before they become disasters." The company implemented new policies that gave the compliance team more authority and longer timelines for critical reviews. My role evolved from someone who just checked boxes to someone who was consulted on major business decisions that had regulatory implications. 6 months later, when our annual performance reviews came around, Rob wrote in my evaluation, "Natalie's attention to detail and thorough approach to compliance work has proven invaluable to the company. Her expertise prevented what could have been a business-ending regulatory violation." That's quite different from too detail-obsessed and very slow, isn't it?